Good morning, church family. We're in Psalm 132 today. Let's jump straight in. This is a psalm sung in the space between promise and fulfillment. In verses 1 and 2, we get a familiar Bible theme, looking back to when God fulfilled his promises to his people. The psalmist looks to David, as David looks to Jacob. The psalmist sees David enduring hardship, looking to the mighty God who answered Jacob's prayers, and now the psalmist prays himself, knowing how God answered David's prayers, who himself knew how God answered Jacob's prayers. Now imagine Esther reading this psalm in Babylon, standing in solidarity with Jacob and David and the psalmist, enduring hardships, waiting for God to fulfill his promises. Generation after generation, looking back to testimonies of God's goodness, spoken in the middle of hardship, seeing endings that those older saints couldn't see yet. Let me pick out three things we see about God in this psalm. Firstly, he's personal. Every reference to him in this psalm is personal, whether as the God of Jacob or using his personal name, the capitalized Lord in our Bibles, which stands for Yahweh, the personal name of God. He has always been a personal God who instigates relationship with us. Secondly, he is committed to covenants. David swore to the Lord, not as some great act of righteousness, but in response to God's commitment to covenant relationships. Imagine how strange verse 11 would seem if we weren't steeped in the Bible. This idea that the mighty God of the universe swore a sure oath to a man. But this is our God. He binds himself to us despite his greatness. He is personal and he commits to people in covenants. But we see a third truth here as well. He is kind. You and I know that the covenant in verse 12 is unattainable for us, as demonstrated by the history of the kings of Israel. But we also know the massive spoiler for this psalm, that God himself fulfills our side of the covenant in Christ. But notice God's kindness even in that moment in history when the spoiler wasn't known. Straight after laying out the seemingly impossible covenant, he jumps straight to reassurance. This will happen. I will fulfill this, not because people will make it happen, but because of God's own will. Look at verse 13. The Lord has chosen, he has desired. This is God's will in action. Verse 14, here I will dwell, for I have desired it. Verse 15, I will bless and satisfy. 16, her saints will shout for joy. And verses 17 and 18 point to the coming one. We know Jesus Christ, who will fulfill the covenant even though so many sons fail. But let's linger one moment in verse 16. This whole section is an embellished yes to the prayer offered up in verses 8 to 10. The Lord and his blessing will dwell with his people more abundantly than we ever imagined. The saints will shout for joy. The promise to David will be fulfilled. But here's a little detail. There's an important difference between the prayer and the fulfillment in the clothing of the priests. The prayer asks that they would be clothed with righteousness, but the Lord, in fulfilling his promises superabundantly, clothes them instead with salvation. The Lord is nudging us away from the idea that we, or any leaders, will achieve that complete righteousness, but promising us a time when both we and our leaders will be free from sin and free to dwell where he is through his salvation. He is profoundly kind. When we ask for righteousness, he grants salvation. So 3 things to remember about our God today. He is personal. He uses our names. He's covenantal. He chooses relationship with us and always keeps his promises. And thirdly, he is kind. When things look difficult from our vantage point, remember that his kindness is rushing towards us and will have the last word.